Next up we have Ms Ellie Cresswell from the University of Sydney. So Ellie's been working on a project on the Battle of Hamel, which of course the 100-year anniversary is coming up this year on the 4th of July. As you'll see, she's looking at it, I think, in a much more broad-ranging sense than perhaps has been done to this date, but I'll let her tell you about that. Ellie's completed a double degree, a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Arts in History at the University of Wollongong, and she's currently, and then she moved on to do honours. And what she looked at in her honours project was the experience of Australian soldiers' mothers back home in Australia, and sort of what they went through while their sons were away, and also looking at the mothers whose sons didn't come back. She's currently doing a Masters up at the University of Sydney in Museum and Heritage Studies. She's going to be finishing that fairly soon. And then she's thinking about going on to a PhD, and she's thinking about topics and places to study and that sort of thing. But I will let her tell you about what she's found about the Battle of Hamel. So can we welcome Ellie? Thank you.
Okay. So, when it comes to decisive battles of the First World War, the Battle of Hamel appears to be a relatively minor affair. Taking place in the early hours on the 4th of July 1918, the attack lasted for a total of 93 minutes and involved the effective coordination of 4 major arms: infantry, artillery, air power, and armour. This date was intentionally chosen to correspond with American Independence Day, owing to the presence of American troops who had recently arrived on the Western Front. Even though Hamel was considerably minor in the grand narrative of fighting on the Western Front, it has been praised for its impact on the Allied position and influence on future events. This battle has been understood as indicative of Sir John Monash's fighting on the Western Front, and has been praised for its impact on the Allied position and influence on future operations. This battle has been... Next slide. The plans for this battle focused on the cooperation of 4 major arms. Used throughout the war, these particular roles of these arms at Hamel were largely experimental. Monash acted as part of a team within the wider structure of the British Army. He incorporated their resources to develop a plan that tested the value of a new offensive against the German army. To show this, I'll be focusing on 2 innovations used at the Battle of Hamel: tanks and aerial ammunition drops. I will then look at the incorporation of these advances into the creation of the battle plan, how these different arms cooperated during the battle itself, and the lessons and aftermath of the event. The purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate how Hamel acted to test the success of a new type of mobile offensive. During the revolution in November 1917, the Russians withdrew from the war. This led to the transfer of more than 1 million German troops to the Western Front to take part in the Spring Offensive. The area that we'll be looking at today is just down here around Amiens, Villers-Bretonneux and Hamel. Known to the Germans as Operation Michael, the objective was to reach Amiens. Achieving this would drive a wedge between the British Army in the north, up here, and the French Army in the south. By doing this, it would sever the two along the Somme River. In the end, the Germans failed and were stopped at Villers-Bretonneux, a mere 10 kilometres from Amiens. Despite this, exceptionally heavy casualties were sustained by both sides. For most of the war, Hamel had been several kilometres behind the British front line, but it was during the Spring Offensive that the German army claimed the village of Le Hamel and the surrounding areas. While the German army held a relatively important position, its morale was seriously depleted and the defences were uneven along the front. After Monash's promotion to commander of the Australia Corps in June 1918, he ordered a series of raids along the Australian front, also known as peaceful penetration. The success from these informal daylight raids allowed for gradual progress and boosted the morale of the Australian troops. The 2nd Australian Division, however, which was located north of the Somme River, was experiencing enfilading fire along their right flank from the Germans in the south. This was a result of the salient, which is indicated by the red line in the centre here. This area encompassed the village of Hamel, as well as the nearby Hamel and Vere woods. Assaulting Hamel would straighten the front line and act as a springboard from which the Allies could launch their own counter-offensive. Hamel was less heavily defended than other areas of the Western Front. The German trenches were poorly constructed and wire obstacles were minimal. Yet despite this weakness, there was an acute awareness that the 5 Australian divisions had all suffered heavy casualties at Passchendaele and the blunting of the German drive on Amiens. They had suffered over 15,000 casualties since the start of 1918. This raised questions as to whether an attack on Hamel was worth the cost to the AAF. So this area is just the modern view of Hamel. This in the centre here is Hamel itself. To the left here is Hamel and Bear Woods, and Pear Trench, which is another objective, was in the centre here. 3 years of experience of fighting on the Western Front revealed a serious need for firepower to support the advancing infantry. This resulted in a steep learning process as the British and Dominion forces began developing new technologies and tactics to overcome the challenges of trench warfare. While progress was slow and costly, 1918 saw an array of modern weaponry that could be used successfully in a mobile offensive capacity. The sporadic use of these tanks throughout the war had resulted in a suspect reputation. While their destructive power was extensive, early variants could be slow, unreliable, and had limited manoeuvrability. They were prone to being knocked out of action by anti-tank ammunition, get ditched in unseen trenches, and even by tree stumps. This was evident when the Australians first worked alongside tanks at Bullecourt in April 1917, during which the tanks were either late or didn't show to support the 4th Australian Division, leading to over 3,000 casualties. The result of the fighting at Bullecourt was a deep-seated distrust in the tanks for offensive actions, especially among those who were present at the battle. In November that same year, the Battle of Cambrai demonstrated that the chief power of the tanks was in its mobility. This proved that they could actually assist the infantry in achieving their objectives. Advancements in tank technology culminated the introduction of the Mark V. This tank could move as fast as a running infantryman, was able to be driven by 1 man as opposed to 4, had better visibility, and increased turning power. While these changes improved the capability of the tank for offensive action, the distrust of the tanks by the infantry was a serious impediment to their use and would need to be overcome if the two were to cooperate effectively. While some limitations still plagued the Mark V, namely its vulnerability to anti-tank weaponry, the commander of the Tank Corps, Brigadier General Hugh Ellis, recognised their offensive potential. On the 3rd of January 1918, he wrote to General Headquarters, imploring them not to underestimate the capacity of the tanks to work with the infantry and artillery. He believed that every effort should be made to supplement the manpower at our disposal by machine power. He then suggested that if the infantry was to be trained to cooperate with the tanks and aeroplanes, not only will its potential hitting power be increased many times, but the new method of warfare may be inaugurated against which the enemy is at present impotent. In June 1918, Captain Lawrence Wackett of the Australian Flying Corps was commissioned to develop a method for dropping small arms ammunition to troops on the ground. This appeared to be inspired by the Germans, who were also developing ways to resupply their ground troops from the air during the spring offensive just a few months before. As with the use of tanks, the intent was to save casualties and provide troops with a sufficient supply of ammunition rather than encumber them with extra equipment during their assault. Carrying 1 box of ammunition would typically take 2 runners, who were required to negotiate their way through a treacherous terrain under hostile machine gun and artillery fire. Inevitably, this led to a considerable number of casualties from both enemy and friendly fire as they made their way through to no man's land. Wackett's design involved attaching parachutes to ammunition boxes and placing them in the bomb racks of RA-8 reconnaissance aircraft. Preliminary experiments determined that these boxes could be dropped from a height of approximately 300 metres and land within 90 metres of the target. While Wackett was not immediately informed of the intent of this invention, the experiments were successful, and it determined that the technique would be used in future operations. Recognising the need to straighten the front line while limiting the number of casualties, both the commander of the 4th Army, General Henry Rawlinson, and John Monash saw the potential of using the tanks in the forthcoming attack. Determined to reclaim Hamel Village and the surrounding area, Monash sought the expertise of Brigadier General Anthony Courage of the 5th Tank Brigade, requesting him to develop a proposal for Hamel. The result, which was based on the British Army's experience during the Battle of Cambrai, was primarily a tank operation. The tanks would be needed to support the infantry with some air involvement in the form of noise cover. The idea of this was to remove the need for a protective artillery barrage, which warned the enemy of a coming attack, by replacing it with the firepower of the tanks. These decisions were based on intelligence that revealed that the morale of the Germans in this area was low and the defences below standard. This created a soft target for the offensive, perfect for practicing the effectiveness of a new coordinated approach. Determined to ensure that all aspects of the coming battle were fully understood by all levels of command, several conferences were conducted through which secrecy was paramount and written orders were limited. Each conference only included individuals who were directly relevant to the current planning stage. As plans developed further and became more complex, more officers were added to provide their expertise. The final conference included 250 officers, 133 agenda items, and ran for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Every point was to be settled upon as it came up, and no alterations were allowed once a decision had been made. The purpose of this was to avoid confusion and ensure that everyone who attended understood every aspect of the plan. Once this had been achieved, the men made themselves familiar with a terrain model of the Hamel area to better understand their unit's role in the coming days. It was at the first conference on the 25th of June that the key modifications took place, namely in regards to the nature of the operation. Chief of Staff Officer Brigadier General Thomas Blamey, Commander of the Australian Artillery Brigadier General Walter Coxon, and the 4th Australian Division Commander Major General Ewan Sinclair McLagan all took issue with the heavy reliance on tanks. Minutes of this conference revealed that this was due to the unreliable nature of the machines in the past, and also the fact that it was Sinclair McLagan's men who had been severely impacted by the tanks at Bullecourt in 1917. This was a result as McLagan was concerned that the tanks would draw fire on his men in the field. Outlining the advantages and disadvantages determined that the artillery method was more certain, while the tank method would be more of an experiment. While tanks could provide a surprise attack, their uncertainty of their mechanics and lack of training with the infantry meant that it outweighed their benefits. To satisfy these concerns while allowing for experimentation of the tanks, the modified plan incorporated a creeping barrage from the artillery which lifted in 3 and 4 minute intervals. The tanks would act as support to the advance of the infantry and cover and ammunition drops would be provided by aircraft. 60 tanks from the British 5th Tank Brigade would take main body and reserve positions, but none would be placed in front of the infantry. British, French and Australian artillery units were to provide a protective creeping barrage and supporting bombardments on the flanks of the attack area. Regarding air power, No. 3 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps would provide noise cover for the tanks and bombing support, while 12 RE-8 aircraft of the No. 9 Squadron Royal Air Force were to carry packages of small arms ammunition in their bomb racks. From the infantry, the men came from the 4th, 6th and 11th Brigades, all of which came from 3 separate divisions. To bolster the battle-depleted units about to go into action, 4 companies of the American troops from the 33rd American Division were incorporated into the assaulting units to gain first-hand battle experience. Along the 6.5 kilometre front, the objectives were divided into 3 sections. Hamel Village on the left, Pear Trench in the centre, and Hamel and Vere Wood on the right. These objectives were limited, with the blue line representing the final objective 2.5 kilometres from the start. As stated previously, the conferences reinforced the current lack of training between the tanks and the infantry. The training location was established at Tank Corps headquarters just north of Amiens. Here the tanks not only demonstrated their ability to overcome strong points such as wire and machine guns, but also taught the troops how to communicate using a bell pull at the rear of the tank and phosphorus grenades to indicate areas of resistance. A report from the 43rd Battalion indicated that the training inspired a newfound confidence in tanks and that good liaison was maintained between officers at all times. The report claimed that the officers attended some of the battalion conferences and dined with us, so that a real spirit of friendship and confidence was promoted. This training and trust would prove to be essential on the battlefield. 0 hour for the operation was 3:10 a.m. and the battle worked like clockwork. Estimated to take 90 minutes, all objectives were reached in 93. While the immense detail of planning through conferences was no doubt important to the battle, the coordination of the four independent arms has often been described as the battle's legacy. To deceive the enemies in the coming days leading up to Zero, aircraft flew overhead, bombing and engaging ground targets with machine gun fire, while the artillery conducted a systematic process of harassing fire that included both smoke and gas. The ultimate goal of this was deception. At 0-8 hours on the morning of the attack, the drone of the aircraft engines masked the sound of the tanks beginning to move up from the rear. This was successful because the Germans were not aware that anything was out of the ordinary. Smoke shells were used to visually cover the advance of the infantry and to encourage the Germans to don their gas masks, but the bombardment did not contain gas shells. By doing this, the Australian commanders hoped to catch the Germans in their gas masks, where their vision would be impaired, giving a greater advantage to the assaulting infantry. All three objectives were achieved with minimal difficulty. The training with tanks proved to be of great value as the infantry was able to signal towards areas of resistance. The tanks negatively affected the morale of the Germans and influenced the capture of approximately 1,600 prisoners in this event alone. The tanks also provided the infantry with opportunities to occupy ground, proving to be a valuable offensive weapon. In addition to providing noise cover, No. 3 Squadron bombed battery positions and horse lines to act as a diversion. No. 9 Squadron dropped ammunition in selected locations and was able to respond to signals from machine gunners for more ammunition. In the case of Vickers guns, for example, this involved constructing a V out of two 6-foot pieces of cloth. Aeroplanes dropped boxes from an average of 250 metres and over 100,000 rounds were dropped in total. While the attack was a success and the incorporation of new technologies, methods and troops were all untested on the battlefield, they were not unique to the Australian Army, but drew on the lessons learned throughout the British and Dominion armies in over 3 years of fighting in France. The battle and the plan worked flawlessly, presenting the demoralised Germans with a full-scale offensive in miniature. Despite the success of the operation, it's important to remember that even a plan that is perfect on paper can fail. In a pamphlet published after the attack, it highlights the need to consider that the morale of the Australians was high, there was not much wire, the ground was suitable for tank action, and the objective was strictly limited. Despite these considerations and the intensity of planning, errors still occurred. For example, when the 5th Tank Battalion reached Pear Trench, the tanks had not caught up in time. The result was that they faced resistance from the Germans in the area that was heavily fortified with wire and machine guns, ironically the place that the tanks would have been needed most in the first instance. The situation at Pear Trench was made even more unfortunate due to the fact that it was the 4th Australian Division who was tasked with overcoming this section, the very men who had been devastatingly impacted by the tanks at Bullecourt and were therefore the most sceptical of their worth. Additionally, one infantry report noted that a tank strayed across the inter-battalion boundary near Hamel and subsequently fired into another battalion's position. A tank report revealed that the use of so many tanks on a narrow front could be counterproductive, as there was an incident where 2 ran into each other. In relation to the dropping of small arms ammunition, while ultimately successful, there are remarks claiming that some ammunition was placed too far away and other parachutes failed open, potentially wrecking the ammunition inside. One officer attributed this to the hasty modification of the bomb racks preceding the attack. Parachutes also had the potential to wrap around the wings of an aircraft, which happened on at least one occasion. The pilot climbed out onto the wing while the observer took control. It was believed that more practice and preparation would reduce the risk of this tactic and produce a more favourable outcome. Yet while these difficulties arose, none was fatal to the attack. The inclusion of several elements meant that there were many areas of support. If one element failed, this did not mean the objectives would need to be abandoned. Conferences held after the attack determined that tanks could have a greater responsibility in order to create opportunities for the infantry. Tank training was increased, and it was revealed that the tanks could get closer to the barrage than the infantry, who were at risk of shrapnel casualties. While Hamel was not the turning point that led to the end of the war, it marked the beginning of an important alliance between American and Australian troops that continues to this day. One Australian soldier went so far as to state that the Americans proved themselves to be worthy of being honorary diggers. Hamel was a big battle in miniature, which involved the experimentation of tanks and small ammunition drops as part of a broader all-arms battle. The successful utilisation of these advances from the British Army demonstrated a way in which they could be used in future offensive operations. Although small in scale, Hamel could be used as a model for the conduct of future operations on the Western Front. By the end of July, a pamphlet was published by General Headquarters outlining the details of the attack and how it could be used on a larger scale, such as it was at the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918. While Hamel is generally seen as an action that reflected Monash's capable command of the Australian Corps, it was also an experiment to test an all-inclusive approach to mobile warfare, drawing on the broader learning and development of the British armies and its dominions. It sowed the seeds for success for future operations in France, leading Australians and the rest of the British Army to a stunning victory that occurred in the months that followed. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ali. That was fantastic. Do we have any questions for Ali? Yes, we do.
Thanks very much, Ellie. That was a fantastic presentation, and having been to La Hamel, I can visualise everything that you're talking about. With regard to the ammunition drops, did they actually drop for the infantry as well, the 303 rounds, or just for the Vickers guns that you mentioned?
They did for the infantry as well. So the infantry was placed into set locations as they knew the advance of the infantry was timed, whereas with the machine guns, they tended to wait for signals to determine whether they would need them or not.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Presentation, Ellen. I'm struck thinking about Monty and his huge, precise, everything has to be fixed, everybody has to be clear conferences. The parallels are quite striking to me. I did not know that Monash went to that amount of trouble, and it strikes me that that's one of the lessons that British Commonwealth armies learned, and they learned it and then forgot it.
More a statement. Ironically, it's come up a couple of times realising that Monash has been attributed to bringing the conferences as a new part of war, but they were actually used on a more regular basis, which is a little bit more unknown.
Mine too is more of a comment more so than a question, but it struck me. I mean, when we hear about Hamel being talked about in recent times, in recent popular books, it's often said that Monash, was the brainchild of Blitzkrieg and all this sort of stuff. But some of those diagrams that you were showing in your paper just disprove that. I mean, Hamel was an attack. It was a limited attack. I mean, the plan was to advance 2 kilometres with tanks and stop. It wasn't to achieve this massive breakthrough, and that was made clear in my mind with some of those diagrams you showed.
Yeah, I think the important thing that I've definitely recognised through this project is that it wasn't just Monash's idea, it was a team effort. So some different authors, depending on who you're reading, say that Monash was the brains behind the plan, and that's why the Australians apparently won the war. But what I figured out was that, in fact, that he just worked as part of a team, and he was a very effective leader of that team, but they worked together and he took in everyone's ideas all in one.
Alan, the role of the Americans in this, I know, gets a fair bit of sort of press coverage and the fact that they picked the 4th of July. But my understanding is Pershing actually pulled troops out just before the battle and would have much preferred the Americans not to be part of the battle. Yeah. And the second part of the question is, were the Americans actually in the assault waves, or were they sort of in the sort of second or third waves in the assault?
So that's true about Pershing. He withdrew them 2 days before because he claims he was unaware they were going to be actively involved in an operation. He believed they were untrained and not ready. The Americans did not like the fact that they were being pulled out. There's lots of reports within diaries to say that they were very disappointed and angry about it, and that caused some tension between the troops. But essentially, not all of them were managed to be withdrawn. So that's why there were still 4 available for the offensive. Many of them were in the front lines, so especially in Verwoerd and even at Pear Trent, they were available. There is comments that they were very excited and eager, so some of them raced forward and then the Australians were trying to pull them back, going, no, there's a barrage. We don't run into the barrage. We stay back. So it was definitely a training exercise, but that just reiterates the fact that it was more of an experiment to see if it would work because these men could gain first-hand experience.
Thank you, Ellie. That was fantastic. You mentioned that the morale of the Germans was relatively low, and I think the detail that you gave of taking 1,600 prisoners is indicative, obviously, of extremely poor morale. That's a huge number of prisoners to take in such a relatively short time. What on earth did they do with them all?
Well, there are pictures that they just trooped them all back to the back lines, but at the time they just recognised that they were all very young. They tried to be considerate, especially the young boys coming from the Eastern Front who didn't want to be there, or new recruits. But in the end, it ended up being that they just encompassed them, just threw them all in a pile, I'm guessing. I don't really know what they do with them. It's like, what do you do with 1,600 people all at once? Just sit them around in a circle and sing Kumbaya.
Thank you. Can you just expand a little bit more on the team aspect of it? So, obviously Monash is sort of, the main man. But can you expand a little bit more on who the other members of the team are? You did have a picture of sort of, people there, but what role that they played, and anyone else who was significant in the...
So the conferences that occurred, they occurred very gradually. Sometimes they were every 2 days, sometimes they were less. So in the initial stages, it was only a very small circle as they figured out what they wanted to do. As it gradually expanded, they ended up bringing in officers from, so for example, Captain Wackett of the AFC, he was there introducing his own idea for the ammunition drops. So as it gradually developed further and they realised, okay, so we want to incorporate these ideas. That's why in the end it was 250. But they ended up getting to the stages that the men in the ground, they didn't find out until the day before. So secrecy was a big deal. So that's why they only brought in people who were essential to the plan, not even anyone who was outside, until they realised, okay, no worries, we've got to expand this further. So as for who was really involved, it's very unclear. The minutes themselves are very vague and they're few and far between, simply because they didn't want to commit them to paper. Usually, especially in the records themselves, they don't identify who was there necessarily, rather they only identify the big wigs, as they call them. So it's a bit difficult to discern it, but the general pattern is that it increased over time.
One more.
Thank you. Ellie, thank you very much for your presentation. Just a question. You mentioned the major modification that was brought about by Coxon and Sinclair McLagan to basically reinforce the idea with a barrage as well. In your opinion, to what extent did that guarantee the success of the operation?
I think it's to a great extent, simply because if you only use the tanks, the infantry themselves probably wouldn't trust them. They honestly, the idea of just the barrage in general was just more a safety blanket for the infantry. So the use of that was more for the benefit of the infantry themselves rather than the operation. But in the end, they've realised that the tanks could be put in an advanced position in front of the infantry to provide firepower. So essentially, the goal was, according to Blamey, he believed that the artillery would, by using the artillery in this way, it would guarantee the success of the operation. But because it was such a small front, and that the whole situation, it was severely low morale for the Germans, and it was a really soft target. It would have been fine if they hadn't used the creeping barrage, in my opinion. They did it for the sake of the infantry. Yes.
Just a comment about the number of German prisoners. That painting you showed by George Bell on the right-hand side shows a large number of German prisoners being brought out.
Yes. Yes, it does. Any more?
Oh, we probably have one more question. Time for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you, Ellie. It's more in the category of advice. Unless you're willing to go into a witness protection program, your introductory comment about it being a relatively minor battle, if you see an angry man resembling a mobile human roof nail coming at you, wearing an Akubra, his name's Tim Fisher, run.
Okay, yep. Thank you for the advice. I appreciate it.
Very good.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Ali. That was fantastic. Can we thank Ali?